With that, I'm very happy to welcome back our speaker today, Professor Stephen Asma. He's a professor of philosophy at Columbia College, Chicago, where he holds the title of Distinguished Scholar. He is a founding fellow of the research group in Mind, Science, and Culture at the college. Professor Asma is the author of 7 books, including Against Fairness, and that was the topic of his talk when he was last here, On Monsters and A Natural History of Our Worst Fears, Stuffed Animals and Pickled Hands, and that's a history of science museums, I think, and Buddha for Beginners, which was originally published in 1996 and reissued in 2008. His writings have been translated into German, Spanish, Hebrew, Czech, Romanian, Hindi, Portuguese, and Chinese. Professor Asma is a prolific contributor to a variety of different outlets, to name only a few: WBZ, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Chicago Tribune, the Skeptical Inquirer, the Huffington Post, Psychology Today, and the Daily Beast. And today we're very happy to welcome him to speak on lessons from Galileo's trial. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Can you guys hear me all right? Yeah. What if I stand here? Can you hear me all right? Yeah. We're sort of calibrating the microphone a little bit, I think. How's that sound? I can project with professor voice. Okay, thank you very much for having me back here. I had a great time about a year ago when I was here. And between then and now, my son and I have been living in China. I had a Fulbright to teach in Beijing. So that's a whole other topic and fascinating experiences that I had there, but it's good to be back with you. Today we're going to talk about lessons from Galileo's trial, and we all sort of know a version of this story, but it turns out the real story, as usual, is much more complicated, much more interesting. I'm going to try to give us, in the time we have, a better sense of what the actual issues were and what happened, and talk about the larger framework. I'm going to also try out a pointer for the first time. All right, so the way to start is to think about what was happening in Europe, and particularly in Italy at this time. And when Galileo's a young man, basically in 1600, many of you are already familiar being humanists. One of the great saints of humanism, of course, is Bruno, although his actual views were much stranger than you might imagine. But he was sadly burned at the stake in 1600. Why was he burned at the stake? Partly because he held the Copernican view, which, as you know, was that the Earth went around the sun instead of the sun and all the other planets going around the Earth. So that old view, of course, is called geocentrism, which is the Earth center, which is a very old view that Galileo fought against. And, of course, the idea that the sun is in the center is heliocentrism. So Bruno had subscribed to this view, but it was only one of many quote-unquote heretical ideas that he had. He thought the universe was infinite. He was not really a monotheist so much as a pantheist, which is strange because he was a cleric himself. And basically the church said, you should apologize, and he said no, and they burned him in 1600. Now, everybody knew about this. Galileo knew about it. Like I said, he was just starting his scientific career at the time. So that's in the background. That makes sense out of a lot of what happens. But now let's look at what are the various interpretations of Galileo. This one, secular opponent of religion. This has got to be popular here, I'm assuming. And he was certainly contentious, and he was an opponent, but it turns out that his views were more complicated than that. Why is he read that way? Partly because a lot of the papers that came out on Galileo, both from the papacy and his own letters, did not come out until the late 1800s. And when they emerged and scholars started looking at them, what was happening then was the Darwin Wars. Remember? So there's a huge fight in the late 19th century because Darwin publishes The Origin in 1859, and it's a clear fight between secularism and religion. And when Galileo stuff emerges into the scholastic atmosphere, it basically gets read in that way. That turns out, I think, to be the wrong reading, but it's not entirely illegitimate. It's just not complete. Was he a proto-Marxist, champion of the serfs? Some of you may have read Bertolt Brecht's play, Galileo. Yeah, it's a wonderful play. I highly recommend it. And it's got a lot of great stuff in it. But Brecht was basically pushing a view of Galileo as a kind of proto-Marxist. And so that view is probably not correct, although there's some reason to believe in it because Galileo famously liked working class people more than he liked official academics. And he thought people with horse sense, as he called it, were much more wise than academics. We'll see why. All right, was he a devout Catholic? Not well known, but he was. All the way until the end, he was a devout Catholic. This is not well understood, I think, given that this is the sort of story that's often told about him. Anti-Aristotelian empiricist, yes, but I'll explain what that means. Accommodationist coward. Some people have taken the position that he should have never apologized and that he should have burned like Bruno did. That's pretty hardcore, but that view is available, and some people have held it. Okay, so in order to, I think, to understand what happened, you have to understand that the traditional story is it's Galileo versus the church, but in fact he had two enemies. In fact, his real enemy were the Aristotelians. These were the professors of philosophy that held sway in all the universities, and they pushed a certain view of nature, and Galileo and they clashed repeatedly over and over again. And these turned out to be much more dangerous, in fact, I think, than the church was. So in order to understand this debate, I have to give you a quick tour of the science, the sort of revolution, and then what I think happened with the church. Aristotle's view of chemistry was basically, Aristotle's is like a 5th century Greek. He's known as a philosopher. He had a natural theory. He actually had a theory about everything, which is why he was such a potent force in all of Western culture. But he thought all of nature was made up of these 4 ingredients: earth, air, fire, and water. The stuff that's made up of earth, air, fire, and water, let's see, I don't have anything I can, yeah, here's something. Here's my keys. My keys, if I drop them, they're basically going to go straight down, right? Now, we would explain that by gravity, but Aristotle has no such notion of gravity. He says, well, this is made up of mostly earthy material, which is basically solid stuff, and earthy material wants to go to its natural place, which is the center of the universe, which is the center of Earth. So when I drop my keys are sitting there still trying to get lower and lower, but the floor is stopping them. So he thought each one of these have their natural places. If you boil water and steam rises, he thought that shows that air wants to go up. And he thought the natural place for fire was up. And so to us this is naive and charming, but it's not a bad way to explain the way things move if you don't have a gravity concept. But he said, that's the stuff that happens down on Earth, under the level of the moon. And that motion is all in straight lines. It's called rectilinear motion. So when I drop my keys, it goes down straight. There's a 5th element. You've all heard of the 5th element. And it's called ether. The Greeks called it pneuma. And the medievals called it quintessence. We sometimes call it ether. But it is not down here on Earth. It is only what makes up the heavenly bodies, so the planets and the stars. And the planets and the stars, since they're made up of ether or quintessence, they don't move in straight lines, they move in perfect circles. That is their natural motion. There's some debate about whether we have a little bit of pneuma in us. I think the Christians liked this idea and sort of read it as a soul idea, but in Aristotle it's not clear. In any case, that's in the background. You'll see why this is important. Okay, so this is a little map of Aristotle's physics. What happened is the West, not just Christianity, but Islam too, and Judaism, all embraced Aristotle's ideas and basically gave their version of them. In Christianity, St. Thomas Aquinas was given the thankless task of sort of baptizing Aristotle and making him sort of speak Christian. So they embraced the natural world, even though he's pre-Christ. This is the Earth in the center. This is the moon going around the Earth. And so all this in here was called the sublunar realm. So everything in this realm moves in straight lines and is made of earth, air, fire, and water. As soon as you get outside the realm of the moon, out here is the supralunar realm, which is where basically the other planets, the sun, and the stars reside, and that's all made of this ether that we were talking about. There is no overlap everything, the physics and the mechanics that work in here are totally different from all the physics and mechanics that work out here. It's like two different worlds. One world nested within another world. This is a great little version of it, the Ptolemaic system, and it's great because you can see the elements are down here, and then you see the realm of the moon here, Mercury, Venus, then the sun goes around here, and Mars. And out here, you have the realm of the stars, and this is where the prime mover hangs out. This is where God lives out here, according to Aristotle, and he pushes the outer sphere, which, like dominoes, pushes all the inner spheres until eventually we have motion down here. And, the scholastic medievals adopted this view too and just made it more Christian. All right, now, what's the problem? Lots of problems. But this one may have been the most famous because this is what irked Copernicus. So Copernicus could not understand, and many people could not understand, why is it that when you're looking up at the stars, sometimes you will see a planet going along, and then it will slowly come to a stop, and then it will reverse. This is over, the course of days. It will reverse, and then it will continue to go again. This is called the problem of retrograde motion. Why would this happen if everything's supposed to be moving in perfect circles? That doesn't make any sense. And so, in order to explain this, the medievals came up with these ideas called epicycles. They said, okay, we got an explanation. It's still a perfect circle, but the planet is on a circle which is riding on another circle. And they sort of proliferated these epicycles to solve this problem. At one point, one of these physicists was explaining this to an earlier pope, and the pope said, I can't understand this. I wish God had asked my advice because I would have come up with something simpler than this. It was really elaborate. And so it solved the problem because it would explain why a planet looks like it's backing up. Like if you're on Earth and you're looking at it, because as it goes around now, it looks like it's slowing down and stopping, and then it looks like it's going backwards, and then it continues to go again. So it was smart. It was just wrong. Okay, so that was going fine until Copernicus said, okay, here's the solution. Okay, this is a little intimidating, but what he said was, just switch it so that the Earth is not at the center, and put the sun in the center, and put the Earth going around it. Then it solves the problem of retrograde motion very easily. Here's how it solves it. It says, look, here we are. This is the Earth. Here's the sun. We're going around in this direction, right? As you are passing another planet, what happens is, as you lap it, like imagine you're racing with somebody and you come around them and you're lapping them in a race. Then what happens is, it's your changing perspective that makes the planet look like it's slowing down and stopping and then going again. You see? Does everybody see that? Kind of? Okay, good. So this is kind of a terribly intimidating representation of it, but you get the idea. It solves the problem of retrograde motion like instantly, but at a huge cost, which is like everything else you believe about the universe. So people didn't buy it, and Copernicus basically was never sort of vindicated in his own lifetime, and people thought it was dangerous. Now, why is it dangerous? It's dangerous not just because it goes against the Bible, because that story is also interesting, but that's not the important one. It's dangerous because the philosophers, the Aristotelians, embraced the idea that the stuff out there is made of a different substance, remember? This ether or quintessence. And that's the realm of the divine. And then what happens is in 1616, well, a little earlier, like 1610, Galileo starts fooling around and making his own telescope. He hears about a device that was made in Holland. It's described to him in detail. He realizes that if he makes one of these things, he can make a lot of money. And because he knows that if he sells it to the government, they can use it as a spyglass in military campaigns. And sure enough, he designs a telescope that turns out to be better than the sort of Dutch one. And he sells it to the Venetian government, and he quadruples his salary. And he gets tenure for life. So it was a very smart move. He was a very expedient thinker. But he also then starts, of course, to use the device to investigate the heavens. And one of the things he discovers is that we totally take this for granted now, but he's the guy that figured out that there are mountains on the moon, that the moon has geological formations that are like what we have on Earth. And before he noticed this and saw this in the telescope, this was absolutely impossible, because the moon would basically be made of the same ether, and it would basically be perfect. It would not be like Earth, not be like one of the other elements. And he said, well, what do you call all this stuff? And the schoolmen had all kinds of crazy theories, just like the epicycles, to explain it. He said, okay. But he kept looking through his telescope, and then he discovers the moons of Jupiter. And this was really important because he realized that if Jupiter has these moons, Callisto, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and they're going around Jupiter, then he realizes that, well, other heavenly bodies have moons, just like we have moons. And so he begins to see that these are sort of evidence that, in fact, we may be just another planet going around the sun, that Copernicus might be right. But he's not a zealot. I think a lot of people think he was just pushing Copernicus. He was a good scientist. He was looking for the data and the evidence. Sunspots were another thing he discovered. We know what happens to him. He eventually goes blind. But he discovers that there are these sunspots, and the drawings are really great. You can see his drawings and images. And this is also hard to believe. The philosophers are saying, no, the sun is made of this ether. It cannot have changes in it. There's no change in the heavens. The heavens are perfect. And he says, well, what do you call this stuff? And then the philosophers are saying, well, it's some other, something is passing between us and the sun. It's not actually on the sun. They're making up all kinds of stuff. Then famously, his other major revolution is that he glimpses the laws of gravity and inertia. He doesn't formulate them in the way we know now. That takes Newton, who comes after Galileo. But he famously, there's this sort of legend that he's dropping balls off of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Did you guys learn that or no? Yeah. Okay. That turns out probably to have never happened. There were some experiments like this, but he was mostly rolling balls, kind of boring, rolling balls down inclined planes in his house. And he was measuring, how fast would they go down. Now, Aristotle said objects that are heavier will fall faster than objects that are lighter. And nobody bothered to actually test this. And as soon as you test it, you find that that's not at all true. So this is one of the great revolutions that Galileo brings, which is, why don't you observe some things? And if you observe some things, it turns out your theories don't make sense anymore. That was a huge blow to the philosophy tradition of the Aristotelians, who thought we start with the theory and then we get the observations afterwards. And he said, no, it should be the other way around. So this is a refutation of Aristotle's rate of acceleration. Gravity accelerates all bodies at the same rate. All right. This was really making the Aristotelians angry. You have to understand this as a sort of economic issue, too. Professorship's on the line. Advancement is on the line. Here he's coming and challenging these people with a lot of good evidence, and their jobs are at stake. They also want to protect the status quo, so he's making enemies right and left. Eventually, then, he comes to embrace heliocentrism, not at first, but eventually as the evidence racks up. But he does not do it loudly. He actually does it very quietly. And he actually treats it like one option among many, but it's probably the best option. All right. Now, these are the things that really get him in hot water. He rejects a number of Aristotelian assumptions. Let's look at these real quick. Scientific reasoning must follow observation. That's the one I just mentioned. Very, very important. Galileo gives us modern science in that sense. 2, science must pursue laws rather than causes. This is kind of interesting. Aristotle thought if you want to understand something, you must understand what its causes are. So, and this turned out to get mystical very fast, because for Aristotle, the cause of thing is its essence. So what is the cause of, the moon or the sun? You must talk about the essence or the purpose of it. Galileo comes along and says, who cares about the essence of it? I don't care what it's made out of or what its metaphysical properties are. Let's just measure it and formulate a law. And if we have a law, we can make predictions. He says at one point, I don't care if the sun is made out of quintessence or polenta. It doesn't matter to me. What matters is, can I predict how the motions are going to go? So this is really important because this is also the sign of modern science. This is when science changes radically. They forget about causes and metaphysics and start thinking about just predictability. science must give up on essences and purposes. Nature is a unified material system. So now it's not like one world contained in a totally different world, metaphysical perfection. It's all of nature is the same stuff and same processes and same machinery. That again that's the start of modern worldview. Science is a method, not a body of knowledge. This again is a huge break with Aristotle. And let me just say this about Aristotle. Aristotle himself is much more sophisticated and nuanced than the Christian version of him. So that has to be said. This is a sort of medieval scholastic version of Aristotle, all this like dogma. That's not the real Aristotle. All right. Now let's get to the juicy stuff, which is the church heresy stuff. Why is it that the church was angry? Now, it's important to realize that Galileo was friends with many of these church fathers, figures. People like Bellarmine and the popes, Galileo knew them. They were friends. They debated things all the time. There was not this hostility from the start. They were intellectuals together. Galileo was regularly educating them on issues and debating them. But here's what happened is some of the Aristotelians who were irritated with Galileo basically just threw some charges at him and basically forced the hand of the church. They said, Galileo is violating the Council of Trent. What is the Council of Trent? Imagine now we're in the sort of early 1600s. What has recently happened? The Protestant Reformation. So you have to understand Europe is a clash between the Catholics and the Protestants. And one of the major sticking points between them is interpretation of Scripture. What happens is Protestants basically, they reject the hierarchy of the church, they get the printing press going with Bibles, they start talking about Christianity as a personal relationship with God and Jesus, and the Catholics are like, whoa, that's our job. We tell you what to think about Jesus and the Scriptures. And the Protestants are going, no, we can interpret it ourselves. So this becomes a huge debate. The Council of Trent comes along and says, it's a Catholic document that says, you don't interpret the Scriptures. The Church interprets the Scriptures, and we basically read them literally. There's no sort of symbolic reading of the Scriptures. They are literally true. End of story. You violate that, it's a heresy. So that's the Catholic position in response, in large part, to Protestant sort of free interpretation, or rather more subjective interpretation. This is one of the problems, is that becomes a really big issue. But here are the Bible passages. There's several places in the Bible where it says stuff like, tremble before him all the earth, yes, the world is established, it shall never be moved. Nobody really was upset by this. The Pope didn't care that much about this. But the problem was that Aristotelians kept going to people like the Medicis, like Christina de Medici, and saying like, hey, have you noticed that Galileo's ideas are Copernican, and they basically contradict the Joshua passage, which says that God held the sun and the moon stood still so that the battle could happen? And they're like, yeah, that's weird. I didn't realize that. We better look into that. So let's send his work to the Inquisition. And the Inquisition basically drags him to Rome from Florence in the 1600s. He gets nervous, and he writes a very important letter to Christina de Medici, which is called, you can still get it easily. I highly recommend it. It's one of the best things. It's an elaborate letter to Christina. In it, he makes this argument. He says, the Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. And so in this wonderful letter, he argues that, look, the church should be above and beyond the sciences. And that the function of the church is to tell us about redemption, morality, meaning. The function of the sciences should be to tell us about nature. So basically, they are doing two totally different things. He argues this very explicitly in the letter. And this is sometimes called the NOMA principle. It stands for non-overlapping magisteria, which means science is one domain, religion is another domain. They do not cross each other. They don't intersect with each other. They should be left to their own devices, and then everybody will get along fine. This is Galileo's argument in the letter. And when he makes this argument, he's smart because he realizes he could have a heresy on his hands here. So he says, this was the view of Augustine. which arguably it was his view. Augustine has a very sophisticated view about religion and nature. But he says, look, I'm just being a good Catholic. And so this is the view that Galileo works out. And then more famously, Stephen Jay Gould has articulated this view in the 1990s. Some of you may know about Stephen Jay Gould's work. All right. The Pope and Cardinal Bellarmine say, all right, we can live with this, but look, do not, by any means, teach Copernicus's ideas as truth or as real. You can only teach them as a hypothesis. So look here. In 1616, Pope Paul V, together with Cardinal Bellarmine, forbade Galileo from treating the Copernican system as true. It must be treated as an hypothesis only, so for navigation and for calculation. That's fine, they said. Galileo agrees and works on other projects for almost a decade. Then he starts writing his famous dialogues. So now you'll see why this gets sort of interesting fast. Now this is the sort of smoking gun right here. What happens is there's a Dominican division of the Inquisition that's in on this trial with Bellarmine. They submit an unsigned, unauthorized injunction against Galileo that went beyond the Pope's and Bellarmine's warning. This injunction forbade Galileo from ever teaching the Copernican system. Now, they wrote this at the same time. They're in on the same warning trial of Galileo in 1616. Bellarmine looks at it and says, no, that's not what we said, and he refuses to sign it. But this document gets into the papal records. The injunction was unknown to Galileo. He never saw it. And the Pope didn't see it either because Bellarmine rejected it, but it was mysteriously entered into the papal files anyway. This turns out to come back with a vengeance later. All right. So at this point, Galileo thinks, I can talk about the Copernican system, but only as a hypothesis, fine, no problem. Then we fast forward a little bit. Maffeo Barberini becomes Pope Urban VIII, and by the way, Galileo was friends with Barberini. He was friends with Urban, and they discussed issues all the time, no hostility between them whatsoever. Galileo then publishes the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems in 1632. Now, this is when all the trouble starts. So he has characters debating the Aristotelian view versus Copernicus. And he has the people who are representing the Aristotelian view, he names them simplicio, like simpleton. And, so the Aristotelians are angry about this. And this turns out to get worse because the Pope starts to see that maybe he's being made fun of here. But this is in 1632, and the book is just coming out, and then all of a sudden, we have to sort of go through this slowly so you can see the logic here. Pope Urban is mysteriously shown the bogus injunction against Galileo, which is in the files. The Pope mistakes the document as binding and interprets Galileo as betraying his trust and his friendship. So that Stillman Drake, one of the great Galileo scholars, thinks he's identified who the Aristotelian professor was who sort of alerted the Pope to this document. So it's not interesting for our purposes, but they think they know that these were Aristotelians basically campaigning against Galileo. So they used the church against him. Galileo's new book, Dialogues, then, is considered as direct insubordination. The Pope is furious and calls Galileo to Rome for a trial in 1633. Now, Galileo's sick, and he's like around 70 years old at this point. And he says, well, can we just wait a little while? And the Pope is really angry, and he says, we're just going to come and drag you to Rome. So he comes to Rome. And this is an interesting painting done in the 19th century of the trial. There's Galileo with the Pope. The trial takes about 2 weeks. He's not tortured, but he's threatened. He lives quite comfortably during the trial with sponsors. But here's what happens. When they produce this document saying you were never supposed to teach the Copernican view at all, he says, whoa, I never saw that document. I have a letter from Bellarmine that tells me I can teach it as a hypothesis. And they said, oh yeah, right, sure you do. He says, I'll get it. So he gets it. During the trial, Galileo effectively exonerates himself by producing the 1616 letter from Bellarmine, explaining that he can treat the Copernican system hypothetically. This letter invalidates the unsigned Inquisition injunction letter the same year. So everybody face palms, right? And goes, oh, man. Now, Drake says, well, now the church has a problem. You cannot just acquit Galileo, because this looks bad. Church does this all the time. Most organized religion does this all the time. Once they've made a mistake, they basically try to cover it up by sticking to it harder. And so that's what happens. Acquitting Galileo would throw doubt and disgrace on the Inquisition and the papacy. Now, why is this important to them? Because they have competitors. Protestantism is growing. They see themselves sort of on their back foot. They're trying to survive. And they think, well, we better do something. So they basically say, it's probably arranged that Galileo should admit some wrongdoing, and the church would then be lenient with him. So he says, okay, let me go through the dialogues again. So he goes through his book, and he says, yeah, I guess I was a little heavy-handed here, and I guess I was a little too pro-Copernicus here, and I gues I was insulting to the Aristotelians here, so I admit to these. And he's thinking, okay, if they're going to be lenient with me, we'll get back to work. So he apologizes, and then they stick him with house arrest, basically. And he's mortified. He feels betrayed. He didn't know it was going to be that bad. But that's what the church did, essentially. So he's crushed by this. He has to go back to Florence eventually. Right after this, his daughter dies. He's a mess for a long time. But slowly he gets back on his feet. The final years. In 1633, he returns to live in his Florence villa under the guard of the Inquisition officers. These guys have oftentimes been characterized as sort of evil doers, but actually they became friends with Galileo. And they let mail go in and out of there all the time, so he was sending books to be published in other parts of Europe. The only thing they were doing was reporting who came and went in his house. But it was not a sort of violent or really repressive situation. In 37, his eyesight begins to fail. In 38, the Dialogues Concerning Two New Sciences is published in Holland, because all of his work was basically stopped at that point. The only thing he could publish would be as usual, Holland. But even in Holland, people are quaking in their boots. At this point, Descartes is panicking because he's just about to come out in favor of Copernicus too, and he sees what happens to Galileo, and he says, I'm going to wait on this. In 1642, Galileo dies. All right. What's the aftermath for the church? In many ways, it's worse for the church, if you sort of want to read this symbolically, because Galileo becomes one of the great minds of the West, champion and a hero. The church ends up looking stupid for 200 more years on this issue. The church tries to justify its mistake by rigidly adhering to it for 2 more centuries. In the 1890s, the church finally shifts to the kind of NOMA position I was talking about before, that Catholicism is here, science is here, we are basically compatible and not in competition with each other. That becomes the official position in the late 19th century. Pope John Paul II finally apologized to Galileo in 92. You guys will all remember that, probably, right? That was when the Pope also said, yeah, this evolution thing looks true. The church has thrived after literalism, handling the Darwinian challenge with material. Let me explain this. The church thought that the only way for it to maintain itself and defend itself is to stick rigidly to the literal interpretation of the Bible. And if we give that up, they thought we're going to slouch into chaos. And it turns out that after they became more symbolic interpreters of the Bible and the Scriptures, they have thrived. Other things may do in the Catholic Church, I'd fill in the blank, but it won't be that they're basically rejecting science, because they don't do that anymore. And so they've had a much more mature handling, for example, the Darwinian stuff, compared with evangelical fundamentalists. All right. What are the lessons here? I'm going to wrap up. Scripture, here's some lessons to draw. You may draw other lessons, and I'm sure we can debate this during the question and answer, but these are some of the things that I think are kind of interesting to come out of it. Scriptural literalism is deep trouble. It appears, as far as I can tell, to be maladaptive wherever it occurs. You see it in Christianity, you see it in this case very clearly. If they had simply adopted a more interpretive, looser view of the Scriptures, none of this would have happened. The same is true in Islam today. We have the same sort of thing going on. The same has been true in most other religions that cannot let go of literalism. Scientific dogmatism is also deep trouble. That's really the Aristotelian philosophers. We have that too. So we have to sort of consider this is a major problem too. Science is fallible. This is really the lesson of Galileo, and we have embraced this ever since. Observation should lead theory. Religion and science can be compatible. This was Galileo's view. He lives and dies, I believe, a devout Catholic. That is debatable, but that's what most scholars think after they've done more careful reading of his letters and such. All right, this is the final point, is the main lesson. Protestant fundamentalism, creationism, and Islamic fundamentalism, heresy, and infidel hunters have replicated the same mistaken logic as 17th century Rome. Here's the logic. They think, we must be dogmatically literal about the scriptures, or else social and moral chaos will result. I spent some time at the Creation Museum down in Kentucky, which is a whole other presentation. But they have the same view. They have exactly the same view. And they think that if you do not accept, very literal scriptures, eventually you just get AIDS and homosexuality and murder and death, and all of society just goes right to hell in a handbasket. And it's essentially the same bogus argument. The Catholic story of success after literalism is evidence that the fundamentalists are simply wrong. That it's just not true. That doesn't actually happen. So that's just one lesson. All right. That draws to end my sort of formal comments, and then we'll have a sort of back and forth conversation afterwards. Thank you.